How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Mem Gimel, Daf 43 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, Daf 43 is an awesome daf. Why is it awesome? Well, we cover a lot of ground. Maybe I'll just jump into, there's 6 sections to this daf. I think all kind of interesting things. So, the first section, well, we have half of Mem Beis Amud Beis to do. So we're going to do that. So kind of the second half of Mem Beis Amud Beis, as well as the first half of Mem Gimel, there's like 5 of the 6 sections there. So the first one being, if tzitzis strings need to be spun lishmah, reasonable question. And then how to dye tchelet. How does that work? How do you do it? So we will discuss that. Testing the authenticity of tchelet, also an interesting question. When you buy tchelet, is there any way of knowing that what you're getting is in fact tchelet and not indigo? Buying a talis. Who can you buy a talis from? We'll also talk about who can you buy tefillin or a sefer Torah or mezuzah from too. Can you just buy it from anybody? Or do you have to be concerned about the kashrus of what you're buying? If tzitzis is a time-limited mitzvah, big question. Mitzvahs esei she'azman grama or mitzvahs esei she'lo azman grama. Of course, big nafkamina. Are women chayeves in the mitzvah of tzitzis or pturos from the mitzvah of tzitzis? Right? If the nighttime is man tzitzis or not. We'll see the machlek is there. Very interesting. And then we'll learn various agadatas that kind of start with working through Urisem Osos Chaitim Mitzvahs Hashem, but then they kind of branch into other interesting, somewhat famous agadatas as well. So, friends, there's a lot on today's daf, all gewaldige things. Also, friends, I think that this might be the last full daf of the last few weeks. You know, ever since like Chaf Tes around of Masechta Menachos, we've been, Chaf Tes, we had the story with Rabbi Akiva, with Moshe Rabbeinu when he goes up to the Rebbeinu Shalom, and then he goes and he visits Rabbi Akiva's shir. And then since then, we talked about mezuzah, we talked about tefillin, we talked about tzitzis. I think that today is, I think the last full daf before we get back into Zvachim. It almost feels like a vacation, But like, meaning, it feels like a vacation, like okay, I'm excited to get back to Kachim. I don't know if excited is the right word, but it's like, okay, I'm ready, like okay, bring it on, Menachos. But sheesh, wow, it's been something the last few weeks with all this lemaisa stuff, and it really gave us an opportunity to pull out different angles of the daf that we haven't been able to work with. Since like Masechta Avodah Zarah, bringing in Tosfos in, and for the first time in Babble on Talmud, we've been bringing in Halacha L'Maisa and Mishnah Berurah, which I've been enjoying. I hope you've been enjoying it too. It's been great to be able to tie it all together. Al Kopanim Chevra, let's learn Daf Mem Gimel, Daf 43 of Masechta Menachos. Let's do it, friends. We begin on Daf Mem Beis Amud Beis, around halfway through the Amud. Amar Rav Yudah, Amar Rab. Ason min ha-kotzim umin ha-nimin umin ha-grodin. Okay, so if somebody weaved let's say a woolen garment, and then, oh boy, I think what happens is, okay, there's the warp and there's the woof. And one of the warp threads, oh boy, I'm not much of a weaver, but, oh boy, I didn't make any diagrams for this. We're just going to run through this quickly. I think basically, the warp threads are the threads. It's kind of like chopsticks, right? You have the one chopstick that doesn't move, and you have the one chopstick that moves. So, like the warp threads are the strings that are fixed, that don't move, and then you take the woof and you throw it in between. You kind of send it in between the warp threads. Anyways, one of the warp threads, I think, tears. So then you tie it together, and then because you tie it together, there's some string sticking down. That. So I started at kotzim. So those like strings that were sticking down got involved, right? Became part of your tzitzis strings. Umina nimin, or if you were embroidering a garment and some of the embroidery threads. Umina grodin, I think that those are like the tassels at the bottom of the tzitzis or at the talis. if those got into the tzitzis strings, psula. In all those scenarios, it is psula. Minasisin ksher. But if because those scenarios they weren't meant to be actually, right? They weren't initially there as part of the tzitzis. But what if you take just like regular thread, and say I'm going to use it for tzitzis strings? Well, that would be ksher. Even though the threads were not made lishmah, were not made to be tzitzis threads, but if you take like a ball of thread or something and you use it for your tzitzis strings, that is acceptable according to Rav. Right? Again, Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, I'm reading this again. So from the kind of ball of thread, it's ksher. Of course, after Rav passed away, Rav Yehuda went to be a student of Shmuel, and he would say over a lot of the halachis, a lot of the teachings that he had learned by Rav. And when he had said over this teaching that a ball of thread that was not made to be used for tzitzis was used as tzitzis, Rav said it's kosher. Omer af menasisim psula, Shmuel said that it is not kosher. That ba'in and tviyah lishmah, that the spinning of the tzitzis strings must be lishmah, must be for the sake of the tzitzis. Kitanai, as we learn in a machlokas tanoim in the context of tefillin. Sipan zov, if tefillin were covered in golden tefillin, shematla alein or behema tmea, or I believe after making the boxes out of kosher hide, I think he then put non-kosher hide on it, or maybe even just made it out of non-kosher hide. What does Rashi say? I don't see if he's. Oh yeah, also batim shall or be'ematmeh. Okay, Pashad, he made the batim. He made the tefillin, basically the tefillin boxes, not the cloths that the parshas were written on, but the tefillin boxes were made at Pashad out of be'ematmeh hide. Psulis. So in these cases, the boxes are psulis or behema tehora kisheris. Now, however, here's where the machlokes comes in. If the boxes of tefillin were made out of tahor animal hide, they automatically, the boxes are ksheres, v'afal pishalo ibdan lishman, even though the tefillin boxes were not tanned in order to be tefillin boxes, right? The hide that was used for the tefillin boxes, even though it was not tanned to be tefillin boxes, none the less, the Tanakama says they are ksheres so long as they're from a kosher animal. Whereas Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says that when it comes to tefillin, even if the hide that's being used for the tefillin is kosher, it doesn't matter if, right, meaning, or let's say this, even if the hide that's being used for the tefillin boxes is kosher, it also still must be made lishmah. It has to be tanned and prepared to be used for the mitzvah of tefillin. If you have kosher animal hide that was not prepared with the intention of being used for tefillin, says Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, that it is possible because it has to be lishmah. Tosfos Taka says, because he quotes from a Gemara in Gittin, that the gvilin, that the margins have to be lishma, and he quotes from there that therefore the halacha is like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, that the tefillin has to have been made and tanned. The hide has to be tanned lishma. So even if it is kosher hide, it still would have to be prepared lishma in order to be kosher for tefillin, and we extend that to tzitzis as well, right? That so meaning when it comes to the tefillin, you have the parshas that were of course written on kosher cloth and everything, but even so, the batim that the cloth are in would also have to be not just of kosher animal but also lishma. So for the tzitzis as well, the spinning of the threads would also have to be lishma, and the Shulchan Aruch paskins this way, both by tzitzis as well as by tefillin, that they would have to be prepared lishma. And now we move on to how to dye tchelet. Amr le Abai l'Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, says Abai to Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, ha tchelta echitz of isula. How do we actually dye? How do we tie? Oh, tie-dye. Do you think that the concept of tie-dye came from making tzitzis? Quite possibly. I mean, we basically just said tie-dye, and we're learning about tzitzis. So how do you dye tzitzis wool? What's the word I'm thinking of? The wad. The wad of wool. How's the wad of wool dyed tchelet? So Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda says, "Ma'isinon dam chilazon." We take the blood of the famous chilazon snail, v'samonon, and some herbs. Urminon lehu biyora. We put it in a pot. U miraschinon le, and we boil them up together. Vishaklina purta beveyisa, and then as a sample, we take a little bit of the dye and we put it in a eggshell. Vita'aminon luhu bi'udra, and then we sample it with the wad, right? So we take some of our dye, some of our chilazon blood with the herbs, and we put some of it in an eggshell. I imagine like a half an eggshell or something, and then we take a wad of wool and we put it together. We mix it together, the wad with the dye, and we see did everything come out correctly. We do a little bit of a test, and then after we do our test, we discard the eggshell and whatever ink was in it. We do not return it back to the rest of the ink. That little sample is removed and it stays removed. V'kalina le'udra, and we burn the wad so that it can never be used again. Shmamina plus, and from those details we learn out three things. Shmamina te'ima psula. We learn that that the test wad, that the test wool is psula, therefore we burn it. Okay, so if you have tchelet strings that were made as part of a test run to test out the tchelet, posel. V'shmamina debe'inan tzvia lishmah, that the dyeing of the tzitzis strings, of the tchelet tzitzis strings, must be lishmah, not l'shem testing, but l'shem mitzvahs tzitzis. V'shmamina te'ima ta'ama pasla, and we additionally learn that from the fact that we discarded whatever dye was in, that we first separated a little bit of dye in an eggshell and then discarded the whatever dye was left in the eggshell rather than returning it to the rest of the dye. So we learn out that whatever test dye, that if the test dye, we learn out that the test dye, that the dye that the wad of wool was test dyed in, that dye, that whatever dye was in that eggshell, is possible. And if you would kind of do some tests, if you would just like chuck some wool into the entire dye to test it, so then all of the dye would be possible. That's why we dafka separate a little bit, so we could do our test in our eggshell and then discard whatever's in the eggshell, because the dye that was used for testing is possible. Hainu te'ima psula, hainu tzvia lishma. For the Gemara, aren't the first two items the same thing? The fact that the dyed wad is, the test dyed wad is possible, and the fact that dyeing must be lishma, aren't those the same thing? That the reason why the test dyed wad is possible is because it was made as a test rather than the shem mitzvah tzitzis. It wasn't lishma. Aren't those the same thing? Amar Rav Ashi matam kamar. Rav Ashi says you're 100% right. That item number two is explaining item number one, meaning matam te'ima psula. What's the reason why we said that the test dyed wad is possible? Mishum debinan tzvia lishma, because we need the dyeing to be lishma, and that's why the test wad needs to be burned. Kitanoi, and this is taka. Now, in terms of what about, right, we said that whatever test dye was left in the eggshell needs to be discarded. it's posel. Kitanoi, it's taka machlekes tanoim if dye that was used for testing is in fact posel. Te'ima ta'ama posla, according to Tanakama, the test dye, whatever dye was used for testing, is posel. Mishum shenemar klil tchelet. In this week's parsha, Parshas Tetzaveh, it talks about the vestments, the shmona begadim of the kohen gadol, and when describing the me'il, it says klil tchelet. It has to be completely tchelet. It has to be 100% pure tchelet. It can't have any test fibers in there. And therefore, whatever was used for testing, or I imagine maybe even for dyeing, you want to make sure that whatever dye you're using for tchelet is 100% pure. What's the word I'm thinking of? Potent dye. Rab Chanina ben Gamliel, that's the opinion of Rab Chanina ben Gamliel. Rab Yochanan ben Da'avai Omer afilu mare sheni sheba kosher. No, you can even use reused dye. That is fine. Mishum Shneimar, as the Apostle says, ushni tolas. This is by the mitzvah, right? Yeah, by the birds and by the mitzvah and his birds. So it says shni tolas, and it also says tcheles in that pasuk. And we learn out shni like sheni, that it can even be. Well, it doesn't say tcheles in that pasuk, but in that. Wait, but also is a. Oh, so there's a pasuk by the ephod. It says Zov tcheles v'agamun tolas shani v'sheish mazar mazeh. Yeah, and there's tcheles in there. There it says tolas shani. Certainly in that pasuk it mentions tcheles. I guess it probably doesn't say. I don't think it says tcheles by the mitzvah. Why would it say tcheles by the mitzvah? But by the ephod of the kohen gadol, though, it does say tolas shani. Anyways, and therefore it can even be sheni, it can even be dye that was already used. Friends, and now we discuss testing the authenticity of tcheles. When you buy tcheles strings, is there any way to know if it's tcheles versus indigo? Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, tcheles ein lo b'dika ve'ein nikachas ela min ha-mumche. It says in the Brisa that there is no way to test the authenticity of tcheles, and therefore tcheles must be purchased by from a reliable expert, so that you can trust the authenticity of the tcheles. Tefillin yeshlem bedika. When it comes to tefillin, you can check the writing and see if it is in fact good kosher writing. But nonetheless, they can only be purchased from experts. According to Rashi, that is because, as we said earlier, the batim need to be created lishmah, and therefore, even though we can check the parshos to see if if they're written properly, sure, but there's no way of knowing if the batim were prepared lishma. Therefore, they must be purchased from an expert who we can trust to vouch for their authenticity. Svarim u'mezuzas yeshlen bedika. When it comes to Sifrei Torah, when it comes to mezuzas, you can also check those to make sure that they are written properly. However, in this case, v'nikochen mikol adam, and they can be purchased from anybody. So Rashi says, why could they be purchased from anybody? Deleko ben ibud lishman, because Sefer Torah and mezuzah do not need to be tanned lishman, and therefore you can, since they're checkable, right? You can check the ksav, make sure that it's written properly, and the tanning doesn't need to be lishma, and therefore you could buy it from anybody. Tosfos Taka asked the kasha on this from the fact that there's a Gemara in Gittin that we referenced a little bit earlier, where the Gemara says there that Sifrei Torah do need to be tanned lishma, that they do need to be prepared lishma, that the hide does need to be tanned lishmah. So therefore, right, so how could Rashi be saying over here that Sefer Torah could be purchased from non-experts since the hide doesn't need to be tanned lishmah anyways? So rather, Taisa says no, the hide does need to be tanned lishmah. The thing is, when it comes to tefillin, we say tefillin is checkable, but it needs to be purchased from an expert. That is because if it's purchased from an expert, so then we don't need to open it up and check the parshias since they were purchased from an expert. And opening up, so tefillin is very invasive to open up the tefillin. You have to, right? They've been sewed shut with the sinews that we learned about, and you have to kind of open it up, and it's kind of very invasive, and it's a bizayon for the tefillin. And therefore, even though yes, we could check the parshas of a tefillin, however, it's very invasive, and therefore we want to buy the tefillin from an expert so that we can avoid having to open them up and to check the parshas of the tefillin. However, a Sefer Torah is not invasive. Mezuzah is not invasive. You could just open up the scroll and check it, and therefore, says Tosfos, that's why you can purchase Sefer Torah and tefillin. No, that's why you can purchase Sefer Torah and mezuzahs from anybody, since it's easy to check and it is non-invasive. Now, frag the Gemara, is that really true that there is no way to test tchelet to see if it's really tchelet and not indigo? But Rav Yitzchak Breder of Yehuda badik lei. But Rav Yitzchak Breder of Yehuda, he had a method for checking tchelet, the authenticity of it. Maisi magbaya gila, he would bring alum. I think I looked up what alum is. Well, I think basically nowadays if you're going to get alum, it's going to be some kind of like a white powder. You just make sure it says alum on it. Umaya de shavlilta, and fenugreek juice, umeimer aglaim, urine, okay, that's easy, ben arbaim yom, but it's got to be 40-day-old urine. Vitari la begavayu, and you soak the wool, the tcheles dyed wool, in this concoction, me'ortavad the tzafra, overnight, from evening until the morning. Iprid chazuse psula, if its color changed, so then it's puzzle. If it couldn't keep its color in that potent concoction, it is puzzle. Lo iprid chazusei ksher. But if it managed to hold its appearance even in that messy, toxic environment, well then it is valid. It's the real deal, and it is tcheles. It's ksher. Rav Ada Kame de Rav Mishmei de Rav Avira Omar. Now Rav Ada in front of Rava in the name of Avira said, Maisi Chamira Arksa Desire, you bring hard barley yeast, V'afi la bigave, and you, I think, bake the tcheles thread inside of the hardened barley yeast. Ishtano l'mal yusok sheira, and if the tcheles wool changed for the better ksheira, ligriusa psula. But if the wool became worse in the hardened barley yeast, well then it is psula v'simonich. And the way to remember when it's kosher and when it's puzzle in the hardened barley yeast, shinui sheker, shinui emes. Well, it's like when there is a change in your word for the worse, well then it is bad, right? Like if you say that something's going to happen and you under-deliver, well then that is bad. But if there's a change for the better, if you over-deliver, well that is good. So here also, even if the wool changes, but it's for the better, then it's kosher. But if it changes for the worse, then it is not kosher. So we had said earlier that tcheles cannot be checked, and yet we see over here that we just discussed two different possible experiments, two different techniques and methods. So my ein lo bedika, what does it mean it can't be checked? Nami dika amr atiima. It means you can't check to see if it's a test version or a lishmah version. You see, that's the thing. Sure, you could test the wool to see if the dye is legit. You can do that. But even if the dye is mamish legit, it may not have been dyed lishmah. It may just be test wool, which is possible. Therefore, you need to purchase tchelet dyed thread from a reputable tchelet monger so that you can trust its authenticity and trust that it was made lishma and not for testing purposes. Marmi mashke, I see tchelta b'shnei Rav Achai. So during the days of Rav Achai, during the period of Rav Achai, and I saw in a note in the art scroll that Rav Achai was a Savorai. After the Tanoim were the Amoraim, after the Amoraim were the Savoraim, after the Savoraim, I believe, were the Geonim. So Rav Achai was a Savorai, and here he is in our Gemara, and it was during his period that a person, I believe, named Mar, from a place called Mashke, so he brought some tchelis and badkuad, and they checked it to see if it was authentic tchelis. But Rav Yitzchak Breda of Yoshua, and they did the Rav Yitzchak Breda of Yehuda. I think I just said Yoshua, but they did the Rav Yitzchak Breda of Yehuda test. You know, the one with the urine. The Iprid Chazise, and in fact, it changed. Its hue, maybe that makes sense. Its hue changed. However, afterwards they followed that up with the hardened barley yeast test, and it changed, but it improved. So now what happens? It failed the first test, but passed the second test. So sover lemifsale. Well, they were thinking, we got to say it's possible. It failed the Rav Yitzchak bar Rav Yehuda test. So Omer Lahu, Rav Achai says to them, Ela ha lo tchelta hi velo kala ilani. So Rav Achai points out, well, one second. From the fact that it failed the first test, we're concluding that it's not tchelet. From the fact that it passed the second test, right. And if it's not tchelet, what is it? Okay. From the fact that it failed the first test, the urine test, that means that it's not tchelet. From the fact that it passed the second test, the hard barley yeast test, that means that it's not indigo, right? Because if so, it would have been bad, but it changed to be good. So therefore, now we know that this dye is either tchelet or indigo, and yet by failing the first test and passing the second test, we're basically saying it's neither tchelet nor is it indigo, but at the same time it has to be one of them. So ela shmamina, rather what it is the following: shmu asa adade itmar, that the two tests complement one another, that they are to be used in conjunction. Hecha dibadakna b'Rav Yitzchak b'Rav Yehuda, that if you did the urine test and lo iprich chazuse kshera, and its appearance did not change at all, you took some wool that was dyed tcheles and you put it in the urine and the alum and the fenugreek juice, and it kept its hue, well then it's clearly kshera. Now, in the event that iprid chazuse, but in the end that the appearance of the wool did change in the urine concoction solution, well then we run a follow-up test. It is at that point that badkinan law b'drav ada b'chamira arkisa. It is at that point that we then move on to our next test, which is the dried barley yeast. Ishtani l'ma'al yusak shera. Now, if at that point it improves in its appearance in the hardened barley yeast, well then kshera. L'greisa psula. But if it gets worse, so then it is psula. So it's a two-tiered thing. So you start with the urine solution, and if it changes in the urine solution, well, if it doesn't change, if it holds its color in the urine solution, so then it is kosher tchelet. If it doesn't hold its hue in the urine solution, if it changes, so then we say, wait, before we say that it's indigo, before we conclude that it's indigo, let us do one more test, and we bake it with some dry barley yeast or hardened barley yeast, and we then look at the result of that. If it got worse, then yeah, it is not tchelet. But if it improved, it actually is tchelet. Shalchu mitam, they sent from Eretz Yisrael to Babble Shmu Asa Adode Itmar, that in fact the two tests complement one another. Rebbe Mani Dayek Vizovin Kichumre Masnisa. Reb Mani, he purchased tcheles like the stringencies of the Bryce that we had mentioned, i.e. buying it from an expert in order to rest assured that it is a-okay. Omleahu Sava, a certain elder, possibly Eliyahu Hanavi, came to Reb Mani and he says, Achi avud kamoi de kamoch, that your ancestors, the ones who came before the ones who came before you, that's what they did. They were makbid like you were. Ve'atzach iskayu, and their dealings were successful. So you did good. Friends, now we discuss buying a talis. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbi said, Alokeach talis mitzuyetzis min hashuk. So if a person buys a talis, like ready to go, 4 corners, tzitzis on all the corners, like just make a bracha, as my great-grandmother would say about my great-grandfather, who I am named after. He would say, Hab talis, will travel. So you buy the talis and you're ready to travel. So Yisrael, if that talis is purchased from a yid, harei b'chezkasa, so givaldik, so you assume that it's kosher, right? The Mishnah Berurah says you don't even have to, right? A yid has a chezkas kashrus. You can assume that the talis that he's selling you is kosher, unless you have any reason to assume that he doesn't have a chezkas kashrus. He does have a chezkas kashrus, and therefore you could buy it from any yid. Now things get a little bit more interesting, subtle, whatever, nothing crazy. But when it comes to Ovid Chovim, now there's a distinction. It depends. Minatager Ksher, if it is purchased from a reputable merchant who has a reputation that he wants to maintain, and if he gets caught selling a talis that is puzzle, he not only will he be unable to sell talises to Yidden, the Yidden won't really trust him to sell anything anymore. So if he is a reputable merchant, a known merchant with a reputation, so then it is permitted to buy a talis from him, because the assumption is that, first of all, he wasn't tying his own talis strings, and that he purchased it from a yid. Minahedjit, however, from a non-reputable merchant, well then, psula, then you can't buy it from him, because you don't know you can't trust, there's no element of trust there. And that is even though there's a halacha that a yid may not sell a talis with tzitzis on it to an ovid kochavim before removing the tzitzis. If a yid sells a talis to an ovid kochavim, he would have to remove the tzitzis first. We'll explain why in just a second. So even though a yid is not allowed to sell a talis to an ovid kochavim, even so, we say that if a yid purchases a talis from an ovid kochavim, if that ovid kochavim has a reputable reputation, so then we can assume that he got it from a yid, even though a yid really isn't allowed to sell it to him. But nonetheless, again, if it's coming from a reputable merchant, we can assume that it is a kosher talis that he got his hands on from a yid. Now, my timer, how come yidden don't sell talises to non-yidden? 2 possibilities. Hacha tagimu mishum zoner. Here in, this was, okay, fine. So here in, I don't know, maybe somewhere that isn't Pumbedisa. So who's saying this? I don't know. Wherever this is, maybe Surah or something. they would say because of znus. Because what can happen is that if you sell a tzitzis to an oved kochavim, he may then visit a harlot and pay her with that talis. And then the talis will say, hey, Cham Yankel was over at my harlotry shop and he even gave me his talis. And then it can create trouble. So we don't sell talises to oved kochavim out of concern that the oved kochavim may visit the local harlot, but then the harlot and pay the harlot with the talis. The harlot will then accuse Cham Yankel of visiting her harlotry business, and that would be not good. Rav Yehuda Omar says, Rav Yehuda, Shema Yislave Imo Baderech V'Yargenu. Now, unfortunately, this is actually a thing that happens. That unfortunately, I believe that's how the Tzuk Eitan war began in 2014, when 3 young boys were abducted by terrorists who dressed up like Yidden. I think they were even wearing tzitzis. Right? So there's a concern that if tzitzis is sold to an oved kochavim, well, then the oved kochavim may put on the tzitzis in order to pretend like he's a Yid, and then a Yid will go travel, will trust him and go travel with him, and he'll push it, kill the Yid. So that is why we don't. So those are 2 possibilities for why we don't sell tzitzis to oved kochavim, either out of a concern of znus or out of a concern of shvichus damim. Friends, and now we get to the big sugya of today's daf. The big sugya. Up until now, we were talking about, does this need to be lishmah? How do we dye this? How do we test that? Where do we buy this from? Now we're talking about, is tzitzis a mitzvah's essay shazman grama or not? Is tzitzis a time-bound mitzvah? Is it only a daytime mitzvah but not the nighttime? Or is it always a mitzvah? So says the Gemara, Rav Yehuda Rami tchelta leparzuma din shebeise. Rav Yehuda would put tchelet, he would put tzitzis on his wife's garment, right? So Rav Yehuda's wife wore tzitzis. Additionally, every morning, Rav Yehuda, when he would put on his tzitzis every morning, he would make a broche of lehisate batzitzis. So now, frag de gemore miderami, from the fact that Rav Yehuda's wife wore tzitzis, kasover mitzvahs essay shelo man gramu. So clearly, then Rav Yehuda holds that tzitzis is a mitzvah's essay shelo azman gramu. Any mitzvah's essay that is not time-based, that is not time-bound, so women are obligated to do. But any mitzvah's essay that is time-bound, so for example, if the mitzvah of tzitzis is only a daytime mitzvah, well then that would be a mitzvah's essay shezman grama, and women would be peturis. So from the fact that Rav Yehuda would put tzitzis on his wife's garment, so that means that his wife was obligated in tzitzis. If she's obligated in tzitzis, it must mean that Rav Yehuda holds that tzitzis is a mitzvah's essay shelo azman groma. Amai mevarich kol tzafar v'tzafar. But the question then becomes, if tzitzis is a mitzvah's essay shelo azman groma, well then why is he making a bracha on it every morning? I understand if you say that tzitzis is a mitzvah's essay shezman grama, that it is a daytime mitzvah. It's not a nighttime mitzvah. So every morning there is a new mitzvah of tzitzis, right? The mitzvah of tzitzis begins in the morning and ends at night, and every morning there's a new mitzvah of tzitzis, and he makes a bracha on his tzitzis every morning. However, if you say that tzitzis is a mitzvah's essay shelo azman grama, that it's simply all the time is tzitzis time, so why is he specifically making a bracha in the morning? Technically speaking, you should just be able to make a bracha one time. Okay, I guess maybe the first time you put on tzitzis, you make a bracha, I'm putting on tzitzis now, and then that's it. It's just always tzitzis time from then on. You wouldn't make a new bracha. It's not like a new mitzvah of tzitzis. It's just a continual mitzvah of all the time. So the answer is, ki Rebbe, because of Yehuda holds like Rebbe, Desanya tefillin, kozman shemanicha mevarich alein. Tivei Rebbe. That when it comes to tefillin, every time you put them on, you make a bracha on them. So even if tefillin is let's say is a mitzvah all the time, or even if throughout the day, whatever it is, every time you take them off and put them back on. So for example, if you take them off, you have to go to the bathroom, whatever, you come back, you put them back on, you make a new bracha. So Rav Yehuda holds like Rebbe that every time you put on tefillin, and therefore in this case every time you put on tzitzis, you make a bracha, and that's why he made a bracha. So even if you say that tzitzis is mitzvahs essay she'ena shelo azman grama, that it's just always a mitzvah, still when I put on my tzitzis I make a bracha, says Rav Yehuda. If that's the case, kol shaita nami. Well, if that's the case, well, then why is Rav Yehuda only making a bracha in the morning? He should make a bracha throughout the day. Every time he takes off his tzitzis and puts them back on, he should make a bracha. Rav Yehuda inish tzniya hava v'lo sharile leglime kula yoma. Okay, well, Rav Yehuda was tsanua, modest, and because of that, he would never take off his cloak throughout the day. He would just leave it on the whole day, and therefore, he wasn't taking it off and putting it back on. That's why he was making it dafka in the morning, the bracha. Umayshna mitzafra, but even so, kilu, still, according to, fine, I understand, he puts on his clothing once, he doesn't take it off. But according to Rav Yehuda, if we're saying it's a mitzvah essay shelo azman gram, which means that it's mitzvah during the day, it's mitzvah during the night. Of course, Rav Yehuda was waking up before daylight. It was probably davening nates or whatever it was. So why did he only make a bracha during the morning? Nighttime is also zman tzitzis for Rav Yehuda. So he could have made a bracha when he put on his tzitzis even in the middle of the night. Kilu. Why dafka in the morning? So kimishane miksus laila liksus yom. Well, Rav Yehuda would make the bracha specifically when he would change from his nighttime garments to his daytime garments. So in the morning, he would change from his nighttime garments to the daytime garments, and that's when he would make the bracha. So even though, the mitzvah is in the night, but when it comes, right, it's the night and the day, but when it comes the day and he would put on his daytime clothing, that's when we make the bracha. I mean, the question is still, well, then when he puts on his nighttime clothing, he should also be making a bracha on the nighttime clothing. If there's just always a mitzvah, so then I think I saw somewhere that maybe Rav Yehuda never took off his nighttime clothing, so you never made a separate bracha on that, but on the daytime clothing you did. I don't know. It's an interesting question. Right? Meaning, okay, so he put on his daytime clothing and he made a bracha on that. That makes sense. But still, what about his nighttime clothing? He should have made a bracha on that too. So it's kind of peculiar answer of the Gemara. Anyways, so we see that Rav Yehuda holds that tzitzis is a mitzvah's essay shelo azman grama, that tzitzis is a constant mitzvah, day, night, 7 days a week, the whole year, and therefore his wife also wore tzitzis, mitzvah saseh shelo azman grama. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, hakol chayovim b'tzitzis. Everybody is chayav in tzitzis. Kohanim, Levim, v'Yisraelim, Kohanes, Levis, and Yisraels. Gerim, Noshim, v'Avodim, proselytes, women, and slaves. Reb Shimon poter b'noshim. Reb Shimon says that women are peturis from tzitzis, mipnei shemitzvahs eseh shazman gramu, because, says Reb Shimon, tzitzis is a mitzvahs eseh shazman grama, unlike the Chachamim. Tanakama says it's a mitzvah eseh shelo azman grama, right? And therefore women are chayavos in tzitzis. But says Reb Shimon, it's taka mitzvahs eseh shazman grama, v'chol mitzvahs eseh shazman grama, noshim peturis. When you have a mitzvahs eseh shazman grama, women are peturis. Now, Tosfos taka on Daf Mem Amid Beis, Tosfos says that the halacha is taka like Reb Shimon because he brings proofs from all over Shas, basically, that there's always this assumption that tzitzis is dafka a daytime mitzvah. Now, even though technically if you wear a daytime garment at night, you're still going to wear a tzitzis on that garment at night if it's a daytime garment. But nonetheless, the fact that the garment is defined by the fact that it's normally worn during the day, it means that daytime is kind of baked in to whether there's a chiyuv in a particular garment to have tzitzis. If it's a nighttime garment, you wouldn't put tzitzis on it. So therefore, and that seems to be the assumption kind of throughout Shas, right? That daytime garments have tzitzis, nighttime garments don't. That in that respect, tzitzis is mitzvahs essay shazman grama, and the halacha therefore says Rabbeinu Tam that we see from examples throughout Shas that the assumption seems to be like Reb Shimon that tzitzis is mitzvahs essay shazman grama. Now, Omer Mari had said, "Hakol chayim b'tzitzis kohanim v'im v'Yisraelim." Everyone's chayiv in tzitzis, Kohen's, Levis, and Yisrael's. Pshita, obviously Kohen's, Levis, and Yisrael's. The kohanim v'im v'Yisraelim b'tirei man l'chayiv. I don't understand. Obviously, Kohen's, Levis, and Yisrael's are chayiv in tzitzis. If Kohen's, Levis, and Yisrael's were not chayiv in tzitzis, then who would be chayiv in tzitzis? Kohanim etzrichale answers the Gemara, well, we needed to learn about Kohanim. I may have thought that actually Kohanim would be pturin from tzitzis, because agadatas I may have thought, Oya luchsiv, since the pasuk says, as we've been hearing about recently, Lo silba shadnes tebefistim yachlov gedilim taiseloch. Don't wear shatnes, wear tzitzis. So I may have thought, Mandelo ishtri kilayim legabe bilevisha hu demechai b'tzitzis. Who has the obligation for tzitzis? People who are not allowed to wear shatnes. Lo silba shatnes, semer fishiv dachtov, gedilim taiselach, you're not allowed to wear shatnes, do wear tzitzis. So I may have thought that tzitzis only applies to people who are not allowed to wear shatnes. But the kohanim, oil ve'ishtri kilalim gabayu, lo lechayvu. But the kohanim, since they're allowed to wear kilayim, why are the kohanim allowed to wear kilayim? The avneit. This is of course, the big day kuna are in this week's Parsha, Parshas Tetzaveh. This particular pasuk is from Pikudei. Of course, Parshas Vayakal Pikudei kind of review. It's like a big review of last week's Parsha, this week's Parsha, Tumah Tetzaveh, all of the specifics about the Mishkan and the Klei Mishkan and the Kohanim and their big day kuna. So the Mishnah Pikudei, no, there is a pasuk in Parshas Pikudei that describes. It's a machlekes if it's a machlekes that we saw in Masechta Yoma. Avneto shel kohen gadol zeu avneto shel kohen hedget or not. The avnet, at least of the kohen gadol, was sheish moshzarus cheles v'argavim v'solas shani. I think that it was linen, but also wool. That the gartel, the avnet of the kohen gadol, was certainly shatnez, was wool and linen. It's a shaila about it. The same applies to kohen hedgets. So let's assume. Like that opinion that it applies to kohen hedgets as well. So kohanim oil ve'ishtri kilayim de gabayu, since they are allowed to wear shatnez in their gartels, in their avnets, in their belts, lo l'chayvu, maybe they shouldn't. Maybe they should be parted from the mitzvah of tzitzis, since they're allowed to wear. Right? Maybe only people are not allowed to wear. Only those who are not allowed to wear shatnez have the mitzvah of tzitzis. Right, those who are not allowed to wear shatnez have the mitzvah of tzitzis. Kohanim are allowed to wear shatnez. Maybe they don't have the mitzvah of tzitzis. So Kamash Malon. So what the Bryce is teaching us is that Nehi the Ishtri Be'idan Avoda. Granted that yes, Kohanim while they are doing their avoda in the Beis Hamikdash with their big day kahuna. So according to the opinion that their gartel was made of kilayim, so yeah, in that context they were allowed to wear kilayim. But below idon avoda, lo ishtri. But when they go home at night, or when they go home after the mishmar is over, so they're not allowed to wear kilayim anymore. So what it's teaching is that even kohanim, who while during their service they're allowed to wear shatnez as part of their belt, but after the service is over, they're not allowed to wear kilayim anymore. So therefore they also are not allowed to wear kilayim and tzitzis applies to them as well. Reb Shimon Poter b'noshim my taima to Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon says that women are paturas from tzitzis because it's the mitzvah's essay shezman grama. How come? Tisani we learn in the Brisa uriisem also pralich suslayla. Uriisem also you have to be able to see the tzitzis to the exclusion of nighttime garments. You can't see nighttime garments. It's night. It's dark. You don't see anything. Maybe that's not what it's teaching. Maybe it's teaching reasonable, so you have to be able to see it to the exclusion of blind people. People who are blind are part of the mitzvah of tzitzis since they can't see the garment. You have to be able to see it. When the pasuk says asher tchaseba, right? When the pasuk says Gedilim taisilach al arba kanvos ksuscha asher tchaseba, that you will cover yourself in it. Hare ksus suma omer. That is coming to include even the garment of a blind person that he covers himself in is chayiv in tzitzis. Hamani mekayim murisim also. So then, if that's the case, when it says you have to be able to see it, pradich sus laila, it is coming to exclude the night. That during that ksus yom, a daytime garment is chayiv in tzitzis because you can see it. A nighttime garment is part because you can't see it. Umara isa l'rabos ksus suma ulaotzi ksus laila. How come when we were faced with the option of saying, right, meaning we had two things that came up for us. Is a suma, is a blind person chayiv in tzitzis or not, and is a nighttime garment chayiv in tzitzis or not. We said nighttime garment is excluded, blind person is included. How come? The answer is I will include the clothing of a blind person in tzitzis, because at least other people can see his garments. Maybe he can't see it, but other people could see it, as opposed to when it comes to nighttime garments, nobody could see it. So therefore, that is why nighttime garments are excluded, whereas a ksusuma, the clothing of a blind person, even though he can't see it, other people can see it, and therefore it is chayiv in tzitzis. What do they do with ashet chasa? Ashet chasaba. Reb Shimon learned for ashet chasaba to include ksus suma. What do the chacham learn from it? So mibayilu, they learn out the Tanya, like we learn in Brisa, al arba kanfis ksuscha arba v'lo shalosh. The pasuk says that you have tzitzis on the four corners of your garment, four-cornered garment, not a three-cornered garment. Atomer arba v'lo shalosh ela arba v'lo chamish. Wait, maybe it means a four-cornered garment, but not a five-cornered garment. Kshu omer ashet chasaba hari bailas chamish omer. Well, when it says al arba kanfos ksuscha ashet chasaba, so ashet chasaba is coming to include even a five-cornered garment. Umani mekayim al arba v'lo shalosh. When it says al arba, it means four to the exclusion of three. No tzitzis for a three-cornered garment. Umara isa l'rabos bailas chamish v'losi bailas shalosh. How come we're including a five-cornered garment in tzitzis, but excluding a three-cornered garment? Both are not four-cornered garments. Well, not necessarily. Marba'ani bailas chamish is b'chlal chamish arba. I include a five-cornered garment because included in five is four. However, I exclude a three-cornered garment because included in three is not four. Right? A four-cornered garment is what we're going for. So if we test the following statement against both a five-cornered garment and a three-cornered garment, we will get different results. The statement being, this garment has four corners. Five-corner garment, it has four corners, also a fifth, but it has four. A three-corner garment doesn't have four corners. So therefore, since the does this garment have four corners test will pass for the five-corner garment and will fail for the three-corner garment, therefore five-corner garments get tzitzis, three-corner garments don't. And the way that works is you would put tzitzis on four of the five garments. The Mishnah Berurah says that they should be as spread out from each other as possible. The corners that you choose. Reb Shimon me'asher nafka. Reb Shimon includes a five-cornered garment from asher, the word asher. V'rabbanan asher lo mashmalu, but the rabbis don't. According to the rabbis, asher is not coming to include anything. V'rabbanan hay u'reisem oso ma'avdilei. What do they do with u'reisem oso? And now we're going to shift into a whole bunch of agadatas. The rabbis learn out from Uri'isem also, like the following verse. Uri'isem also uschartem. Re'ei mitzvah zo uschar mitzvah acheres. It says, Uri'isem also uschartem. You will see the tzitzis and remember. So, Re'ei mitzvah zo, see this mitzvah of tzitzis, uschor mitzvah acheres, and by seeing tzitzis, remember another mitzvah. Hatzluyaba, which is dependent on tzitzis, ve'ezo zo, what is a mitzvah that's dependent on tzitzis? Zo Kriyas Shema. Of course, Kriyas Shema. When's the earliest time to read Kriyas Shema? From Misha Yakir, of course. Misha Yakir ben tchelet alavon. Once you can distinguish between, once you can see the tzitzis, now you can say Kriyas Shema. Titznam, we learned in the second Mishnah in Masechta Brachos, in all of Shas, 6 years ago. When do we read Kriyas Shema in the morning? Misha Yakir ben tchelet alavon. From the time that you can tell the difference, that you can distinguish between tcheles and lavon. So being able to distinguish between white and tcheles now allows you to do another mitzvah, which is Shema. B'tanya idach, we have another brayso. Re'isem also uzchartem. Re'ei mitzvah zo uzchar mitzvah acheres. See this mitzvah and remember another mitzvah hasmuchala that is juxtaposed to it. Ve'ezo zo, what mitzvah is juxtaposed? Of course, to tzitzis. Zo mitzvah skilayim, that is the mitzvah of shatnez. Tichsiv lo silba shatnez, semer fishtim yachtob, gidilim tais eloch. So see the tzitzis and remember the mitzvah of shatnez. Tanida chunan another brayso. Risim also zchaitem is called mitzvahs Hashem. See them and remember all of the mitzvahs of the Rabbanu Shalom. Kimchin is chayiv adam b'mitzvah zo. Once a person becomes chayiv in this mitzvah, i.e., in the morning comes the daytime, and a person is chayiv in the mitzvah of tzitzis. Nischayiv b'chol mitzvahs kulon. He's now chayiv in all of the mitzvahs, meaning most of the mitzvahs are daytime mitzvahs, and therefore comes the morning when it's tzitzis time. It's also time for all of the mitzvahs. Reb Shimoni, and this of course is according to Reb Shimon, the Amar mitzvahs esech azman gamahi, who says that it is a time-bound mitzvah, i.e., it's not always the mitzvah of tzitzis, but comes the day. It is now becomes the daytime. It's a mitzvah of tzitzis, and that is when you're chayiv in a lot of more mitzvahs as well. Tani Yidach within another brayso, Risim also zchaitem is called mitzvahs Hashem. You will see that tzitzis, remember all of the mitzvahs of the Rabbanu Shalom. Shkula mitzvah zo keneged kol mitzvahs kulon. That this mitzvah, the mitzvah of tzitzis, is equal to all of the mitzvahs combined. And Rashi says either because it says we're saying we're associating seeing tzitzis and the mitzvah of tzitzis with all of the mitzvahs, but also as we know, of course, the gematria of tzitzis is 600 plus the 8 strings and 5 knots is 613, the number of mitzvahs in the Torah. B'tani idach, we're learning another b'rais urisem also uzchaitem ba'asisim. Re'iyah mevia lidei zechira, seeing brings one to remember. Zechira mevia lidei asira, and remembering brings one to do. So you see the mitzvah of tzitzis and you say, wow, givaldig, I remember now to do mitzvahs, and then you'll do mitzvahs. Rav Shimon ben Yochai, almost says Rav Shimon ben Yochai, kol hazariz b'mitzvahs, oh, anybody who is zariz, who's excited and active and involved in this mitzvah, zoche makabel pnei shchina, will merit to receive the face of the divine presence. Ksivach, it says by tzitzis urisim oso, uksivasim, it says by the divine presence, es Hashem alekecha tira ve'oso ta'avod. So oso, therefore one who's excited about tzitzis will merit to greet the face of the divine presence. Tanu Rabbanan Da'avistad, chaviv in Yisrael, that the Yidden are so beloved, Shesivivon HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'mitzvahs, that the Rabbanu Shalom surrounded the Yidden with mitzvahs. Tefillin b'roshein, that we have tefillin on our heads, with tefillin b'rosein, and tefillin on our arms. V'tzitzis b'bigdein, and tzitzis on our garments. U'mezuzah b'pischein, and mezuzahs on our doorways. We're surrounded by mitzvahs on our heads, and our arms, and our tzitzises, and our mezuzahs. V'alein Omar David, and David says about this, Sheva bayomi lalticho, amishpatei tzidkecha, that I praise you 7 times in the day because of your statutes. That the seven times correspond to the The tefillin shel yad and tefillin shel rosh is 2. The 4 tzitzis is 6. And the mezuzah is 7. When David HaMelech, King David, went into the bathhouse, and he saw that he was standing there naked, Omar, he says, Oili, Chaval, She'amod Arum B'loi Mitzvah, that I will stand there naked without any mitzvahs, but he remembered, wait, I'm not without mitzvahs, I have a bris milah, Shebibsar, which is in my flesh, Nisyashva Daito, he settled down Nachashiyotzo Omar Alea Shira, and afterwards he wrote a song, Shenemar Lamnatseach ala Shminis Mizmor LeDavid Al Mila Shenitna B'Shmini, that he wrote a song about the Shminis that was a reference to Bris Milah that is on the 8th day. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer Kol sheyesh lo tefillin b'rosho v'tefillin b'zro, says Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, a person has tefillin on his head, a tefillin on his arms, v'tzitzis b'bigdo, u'mezuzah b'pischo, hakol b'chizik shelo yechta. He's a chazaka that he's not gonna sin. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, v'achuta mishulish. Love mer yinotek, that a trifecto thread is not going to easily snap. The tefillin, tzitzis, mezuzah, trifecto. V'omer, the pasuk says, Chone malach Hashem sovev lireya v'yechaltzim, that the angel of God is around those who fear him and he saves them. Tanya, we learned in the Brayso, Reb Meir would say, Manishtana tchelet mikol minei tzivonin. Why was tchelet chosen from all the colors? Mipnei tchelet doim elayom. Because the tchelet is similar to the sea of Yom Dom L'Rakia, and the sea is similar to the heavens V'Rakia, the Kisei HaKoved, and the Rakia is similar to the Kisei HaKoved. So you look at the tzitzis, and you remember the Yam. You think of the Yam, you think of the Rakia, and you think of the Kisei HaKoved. And I guess if you don't have tchelis in your tzitzis, so you look at your tzitzis, and the tzitzis reminds you of tchelis, and tchelis reminds you of the Yam, Rakia, Kisei HaKoved. Shenema, as the pasuk says, V'sachas raglov, and below the Rabbanu Shalom's feet, i.e. the heavens, Kimaise libnas asapir, was like a libnas asapir, a sapphire, and that is blue. Chetzem hashamayim latorah uchsiv kimari even sapir d'muskise, that the image of the throne of the Rabbanu Shalom was like a blue sapphire stone. Tana, we learned in the Brayso, Meir would say, Godol onsho shall love and yosim onsho shall tcheles, that one who is mevatel the mitzvah of tzitzis, the punishment for being mevatel the mitzvah of the white strings is more severe than that of being mevatel the mitzvah of the blue strings, because the white strings are more accessible. What is a parable for this? Lemelech Basav Adam, a king of flesh and blood, that he says to his 2 servants, to one servant he says, bring me a seal made out of clay. The other one he says, bring me a seal made out of gold. Both of them dropped the ball. They did not bring any seals, not of clay, not of gold. Who's in more trouble? The one who says, where you had instructed him, bring just simply a seal made out of clay. Clay is pretty accessible, and he didn't do it, so then he's in more trouble. So similarly, somebody who doesn't do the mitzvah of tzitzis even with white strings, which are more available, so the Rebbeinu Shalom's a little bit peeved. Tanya, a person is obligated to make 100 blessings every day. What does the Rabbanu Shalom What does the Rabbanu Shalom ask for you? So Rashi says that what it means is kribe me'ah. So don't say ma Hashem Elokecha Shalom, but rather read me'ah. 100, a reference to the 100 brachas. Tosfos gives a few different answers, which is interesting. Ma, right? Ma Hashem Elokecha. Ma is begematria in ma in atbash, gar, dak, whatever. So it comes out to 100 because ma mem is 10 in atbash, and hey is 90. So So it comes out to 100. Also, the amount of letters in the pasuk of V'ata Yisrael Ma'ashem Elokecha Shamimach Kim Yiras Hashem Elokecha Lavdo. So that pasuk has 99 letters in it, and if you make ma, if you read it as me'ah, it adds 100th letters. That's also another option of what the 100 could be, but also it could just simply be me'ah, right? Ma is me'ah, 100 brachas. Anyways, there's a few with different ways you can understand that. Reb Chia Brei, the Reb Avya B'Shabso V'Yomei Tave Torach U'Memalelu Be'Isparmekei Umagde. So we just said that there's a chiv to make 100 brachas every day. Sounds pretty daunting. Well, if you say Shmon Esrei 3 times a day, that's 57. And if you make Birchas HaShachar in the morning with the Shenos L'Asech V'Yina, etc., that's another, I think, 16. And then, whatever, you kind of, you add, the Mishnah Berurah went through all these things, and he easily got over 100, but that did assume that you were washing twice a day. It assumed a few things, but it seems like it's completely doable to be able to get to 100 brachas a day. Now, on Shabbos and Yom Tov, however, it's trickier because the Shemona Esrei and Shabbos and Yom Tov is only 7 brachas, not 18 or really 19 brachas. So you lose out on 12 times 3. So that's quite a that's quite a bit of brachas. So therefore, the Gemara recommends to have isparmikeu magde. So I don't remember what isparmikeu is. Maybe like fruits and stuff. I think you should have, what is it? Besamim, right? Fragrances and all sorts of delicacies, so that you'll be making more brachas on things to get to your quota of 100. Let me have a shtick of water and we'll wrap up over here. Tanya, Reb Meir would say, Chayiv Adam Levarich Shalosh Brachos B'chol Yom. A person needs to make 3 brachas every day. Eluain, these are the 3. Shasani Yisrael, although the Mishnah Berurah says, Dafka say, Shalo Asani Goy, Shalo Asani Isha, Shalo Asani Bur, Rav Yaakov Shamei Livrei. Rav Yaakov heard his son David come Mevarich Shlo Asani Bur. He says that thank you for God for not making me a ignoramus. Amar Lei. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says to his son, Rav Yaakov says to his son, Kuli Ai Nami. Rav Yaakov says, why are you saying Shlo Asani Bur? I mean, a bur is chayiv mitzvahs just as much as you are. So Amar Lei Ve'ela Mai Mevarich. So Rav Yaakov's son says, so what blessing should I make? Shlo Asani Ovid. That thank God I'm not a slave. Hainu Isha. But an Eved is chayiv mitzvahs in the same way as an Isha. So what's the difference? Eved zil tfei. Well, Eved is more not pleasant. It's not nice to be an Eved. So therefore, praise God, bless God, they are not an Eved. Friends, that was Daf Mem Gimel. Well, it was a very big daf, but a lot of really good stuff on Daf Mem Gimel of Masechta Menachos. We learned about if tzitzis strings need to be spun lishmah. Rav says nope. Shmuel says yep. And we paskin, the Shulchan Aruch paskins that we do need to spin the tzitzis strings lishma. Tosfos paskins that way as well. We discussed how to dye tchelet. You take the blood of the chilazon snail and you mix it together with other herbs, and then you put in an eggshell and you test it out. You run some tests, and if you and the test dye and the test wools, none of that stuff is kosher. That stuff's possible, which is why, therefore, you also have to make sure that you're buying tchelet from a reputable merchant who you can trust that A, the tchelet is tchelet, and that B, it was made lishma. We discussed testing the authenticity of tchelet. There was the pea test, and there was also the dried barley yeast test. And depending if it passes the pea test, it goes on to the barley dry yeast test. Buying a talis. When buying a talis from a Jew, you can assume it's kosher. As a cheskas kashrus, when buying from a non-Jew, so it is kosher from a reputable businessman who has a reputation that he does not want to ruin. So then you can assume that it came from a Yid. However, from a non-reputable businessman, then you cannot buy the tzitzis. It would not be kosher. Then we got into the big sugya of, is tzitzis a mitzvah's essay shazman grama? The rabbis / Rav Yehuda, so the rabbis and Rav Yehuda agrees with them, is that tzitzis is not a mitzvah essay shesman goma. Reb Shimon says that it is a mitzvah essay shel zman grama. And the big nafkamina is, are women obligated in the mitzvah of tzitzis? If tzitzis is a mitzvah to say shel zman grama, women are peturis. If tzitzis is not a mitzvah to say shel zman grama, women are chayavas. Tosfos Taka says that it would seem that we pass like Reb Shimon here, that tzitzis is a mitzvah to say shel zman grama, because we basically assume throughout Shas that tzitzis applies to ksus yom, not to ksus laila. And then we got into various agadatas about Reisim. Also, we got into a very famous story about David HaMelech when he was in the bathhouse and he didn't have any mitzvahs. And he saw the Bismillah and he remembered, oh, I have that mitzvah. Ma Hashem Elokecha Shoel Me'imoch Meya, to make 100 brachas in a day. Very, very famous. So friends, that was Daf Mem Gimel of Masechta Menachos. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.